The woman in the simple gray dress was handed an apron before she even reached the front door. One of the event coordinators thrust it toward her without looking up from her clipboard and said the kitchen staff entrance was around the back and they were already behind schedule. The woman looked at the apron for a moment. She took it. She walked around to the back entrance. And not a single person standing in that glittering driveway knew that the mansion they were about to spend the evening inside belonged entirely to her husband. Claire Donovan had married William Donovan 7 years ago in a small ceremony with 12 people and no photographer because William had said the moment mattered more than the record of it. William Donovan was 48 years old, ran a private investment firm that operated across 9 countries, and owned several properties including the Hartwell Estate, a 19th-century mansion on the edge of the city that he had purchased and fully restored 6 years ago. He occasionally lent it to charitable organizations for fundraising events at no cost because Eleanor, his late mother, had believed strongly in giving away what you did not need, and William honored that belief in concrete ways. The Hartwell Estate had hosted 11 charity galas in the past 4 years. Tonight, it was hosting the 12th, organized by the Meridian Children's Foundation, an organization that raised money for pediatric health care in underserved communities. Claire worked quietly. That was the thing about Claire that people who knew her well understood, and people who had just met her almost always got wrong. She was not quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she was watching. She had grown up the second of 5 children in a house where money was always just slightly out of reach, and noise was how people filled the space that money left behind. She had learned early that the people who watched carefully saw more than the people who talked constantly. She had carried that lesson into adulthood, and it had served her well in ways that were difficult to explain to people who had not lived it. She had come to the Hartwell Estate tonight alone because William was flying back from a meeting in Geneva, and his flight had been delayed by 4 hours. He had called her from the airport and said he was sorry and that he would get there as soon as he could and that she should go ahead without him. Claire had said she would be fine. William had said, "Claire," she said, "I will be fine, William." He had laughed because he knew when she said something twice it was settled. She had put on a simple gray dress because she had been planning to stay in the background of the evening and support the foundation work quietly the way she usually did at these events. She had left her jewelry at home except for her wedding ring, which she wore always. She had taken a car to the estate. The coordinator who handed her the apron was a woman named Diane who was managing 15 volunteers and 3 catering companies simultaneously and was operating on 4 hours of sleep and 3 coffees. When Claire's car had dropped her at the end of the driveway rather than the front entrance because of the traffic arrangement, she had walked up the path wearing a gray dress with no visible jewelry beyond a plain band on her left hand, carrying a small clutch, looking like someone who was there to work. Diane had seen her, checked her list, found a name that was not there, assumed she was a late addition from the catering team, and handed her the apron. Claire had not corrected her. She had taken the apron and walked around back. In the kitchen, things were already loud. 3 catering supervisors were directing staff. 2 chefs were arguing in low, urgent voices about timing, and a long double sink was piled high with prep dishes from the afternoon setup. A young man named Felix, who was coordinating the kitchen volunteers, looked at Claire when she walked in and pointed her at the sink without introduction and said they needed those clear before the first course came back. Claire put on the apron, rolled up her sleeves, and started washing dishes. She stood at that sink for 40 minutes. Nobody talked to her much because everyone was moving fast and focused on their own tasks. A girl named Amber who was working the sink beside her asked if she had done this before, meaning worked events. Claire said she had spent time in kitchens. Amber said the people at these fancy parties had no idea how much work happened back here. Claire said she imagined that was true. Amber said it like a small resentment. Claire heard it like information. She thought about the people walking through the front entrance right now in their evening clothes, the way a room felt from the front compared to the back, and she thought that Amber was not wrong. At some point, a woman pushed through the kitchen doors wearing a floor-length silver gown and the particular expression of someone who had the authority to be in any room she chose. Her name was Patricia Holt. She was on the foundation's event committee and had been a significant donor for 3 years and moved through charity circles with the ease of someone who had been doing it long enough that it had become its own form of performance. Patricia looked around the kitchen with a vague dissatisfaction, and then her eyes landed on Claire at the sink. She looked at her dress, at the apron, at the plain ring on her wet hand, and said to the catering supervisor standing nearby, "Can you make sure the dish staff are a little faster? The first course is backing up." The supervisor nodded. Patricia swept back out through the doors. Claire kept washing. Amber said under her breath, "Every event. One of them always comes back here." Claire said nothing and handed Amber a clean dish to dry. 30 minutes later, Claire was asked by Felix to carry a tray of water glasses to the corridor outside the main hall because the table service team was short. She took the tray and walked through the back corridor and pushed through the side door into the edge of the main hall. She had not been inside the hall yet. She stood for a moment and looked at it. The Hartwell Estate's main hall was spectacular in the way that old buildings with high ceilings and good bones became spectacular when properly lit. William had spent 2 years on the restoration and had consulted 3 different conservation architects, and Claire had sat through all of those meetings and had opinions about the crown molding that the architects had found unexpectedly informed. Standing in the doorway now with a tray of water glasses, she looked at the room and felt the particular feeling of looking at something you love from an unfamiliar angle. She set the water glasses down at the service table and was turning to go back to the kitchen when she heard her name. Not Claire. Her full name. Claire Donovan. She turned. A woman was standing near the center of the room looking at her with an expression of complete confusion. It was Dr. Priya Anand, the pediatric cardiologist who ran the Meridian Children's Foundation and who had sat across from Claire at a donor meeting 6 months ago, and who knew exactly who Claire Donovan was. Priya looked at the apron. She looked at the gray dress. She looked at the tray Claire had just set down. She said, "What are you doing?" Claire said, "I was washing dishes. Now I am delivering water glasses." Priya stared at her. Claire said, "I came in through the wrong entrance, and someone gave me an apron. I did not want to cause a disruption." Priya said, "Claire, this is your husband's house." Claire said, "I know." Priya looked at her for a long moment, and then made a sound that was almost a laugh, and said, "You have been washing dishes in your own home." Claire said, "Technically it is William's name on the deed." Priya said, "You have been washing dishes." Claire said, "The sink needed doing." Priya pressed her fingers briefly to her forehead, and then said, "I need to fix this immediately." Claire said, "Priya, please do not make a thing of it. William will be here in an hour, and I am perfectly happy to stay in the background until then." Priya said, "You are not staying in the background. You are a board advisor to this foundation. You personally approved the grant that funded the new cardiac unit at St. Matthew's last year." Claire said, "All of that is still true whether I am wearing an apron or not." Priya looked at her and then looked at the apron and said, "Will you at least take that off?" Claire looked down at the apron. She took it off. She folded it neatly and set it on the service table. Priya walked her to the main room and introduced her to 3 people immediately, the kind of introductions that communicated status without announcing it, the way people who move in those circles always did. Claire shook hands and listened and asked questions that were more informed than the people receiving them expected. A man from a pharmaceutical company who was being asked to consider a sponsorship found himself 20 minutes into a detailed conversation about drug pricing in pediatric care that he had not anticipated having with anyone tonight, and certainly not with a woman he had initially assumed was a late arrival from the catering staff who had forgotten to take her apron off in the rush. He left the conversation with a slightly different expression than the one he had arrived with. Patricia Holt saw Claire standing near the center of the room, talking easily with the foundation's lead donors, and felt a slow realization move through her. She had seen this woman in the kitchen. She had told the supervisor to tell the dish staff to move faster. She looked at Claire's face and then looked at the plain ring and tried to put something together. She moved through the room toward Diane, the event coordinator, and said quietly, "Who is the woman in the gray dress?" Diane looked. She went still. She said, "That is Claire Donovan." Patricia said, "Donovan as in." Diane said, "William Donovan." "Who owns this house?" Patricia said nothing. Diane said, "I think I may have given her an apron when she arrived." Patricia looked at her. Diane looked at the ceiling briefly and said, "She walked up from the wrong direction, and I thought she was catering staff, and she took it." Patricia said, "She just took it?" Diane said, "and apparently went and washed dishes for 40 minutes. Patricia stood very still. Then she said, "Does she seem angry?" Diane looked at Claire across the room, laughing at something the pharmaceutical man had said. She said, She does not seem angry. Patricia said. I went back to the kitchen and told the supervisor to tell the dish staff to hurry up. Diane turned and looked at Patricia. Patricia said, I did not know. Diane said, no. There was a pause. Diane said, you might want to say something to her at some point this evening. Patricia said, yes. She said it in the voice of someone who would be thinking about this for quite a while. William arrived at 9:15. Claire saw him at the entrance before he saw her, and she watched him scan the room for her the way he always did when he arrived somewhere she already was. The particular focus of a person looking for the one face that mattered. He found her near the windows speaking with Priya and Dr. Anand's colleague from the foundation. He made his way across the room, and when he reached her, he said quietly, I am sorry I am late. She said, you made it. He looked at her and said, how was the evening? She said, interesting. He said, interesting how? She said, I washed dishes for 40 minutes. William looked at her. She said, I came in through the wrong entrance, and the coordinator gave me an apron. I did not want to make a scene. William was quiet for a moment. He said, you washed dishes. She said, the sink was piled up and they needed help. William looked at his wife. In her simple gray dress with her plain wedding ring and her completely calm expression, and he said, most people who own the building would have said something. She said, the dishes still needed washing regardless of who owned the building. William looked at her for a long moment. It was the look he had been giving her for 7 years, the one that said he was still finding new reasons. He said, I love you enormously. She said, I know. You are late though. He said, I am late. She said, come and meet the man from the pharmaceutical company. I think he is close to yes on the sponsorship, but he needs someone to talk numbers with him. William said, did you lay the groundwork? She said, I spoke to him for 20 minutes about drug pricing in pediatric markets. William said, so you laid all the groundwork. She said, I washed the dishes too, so I think tonight has been fairly productive overall. William laughed. It moved through him fully, and Claire watched it and thought it was still one of her favorite sounds after 7 years, which she considered a reasonable measure of a good marriage. She handed him a glass of water, and they walked toward the pharmaceutical man together. Across the room, Diane watched them move through the crowd and thought about the apron she had handed to the woman who owned the house and the 40 minutes that had followed, and the way Claire Donovan had taken it without a word and gone and done the work without making it mean anything about herself. She thought about the kind of person that required. She had managed events for 11 years and had worked with people who needed everyone in the room to know who they were before they would agree to sit down. She had handed an apron to a woman worth more than anyone at this gala, and that woman had put it on and washed dishes because the sink needed doing and someone had to. Diane stood in the corner of the Hartwell Estates Grand Main Hall and thought that was the most interesting thing that had happened to her in 11 years of events, and she was quite certain she was going to be thinking about it for a very long time. Patricia found Claire near the end of the evening. She walked up to her directly and said, Mrs. Donovan, I want to apologize. I went to the kitchen earlier and asked the supervisor to tell the dish staff to speed up. I did not know that was you. I am sorry. Claire looked at her and said, you did not do anything wrong. The dishes did need to move faster. Patricia said, I did not know who you were. Claire said, I know you did not. She said it without any edge, without the particular satisfaction of someone holding power over an uncomfortable person. She just said it as a fact. Patricia stood there for a moment, not entirely sure what to do with an apology that had been received so cleanly. She said, you are very gracious. Claire said, you came and found me and said it. That matters. She shook Patricia's hand and moved on toward William, who was wrapping up his conversation near the windows. Outside later, in the car going home, William said, Priya told me about the apron. Claire said, I thought she might. He said, she said you folded it neatly and put it on the service table. Claire said, it was a good apron. Heavy cotton. Better than the cheap ones. William said, Claire. She said, it was genuinely a good apron. He looked at her in the dark of the car with the city moving past outside and said, do you know what I thought the first time I met you? She said, you have told me before. He said, I want to say it again. She said, all right. He said, I thought, this is a person who is exactly the same in every room. She looked at him. He said, most people are different depending on who is watching. You are just you. In every room. With every person. Whether you are sitting at a boardroom table or standing at a sink in your own house wearing a stranger's apron. Claire said, "That is a very long way to say I am consistent." He said, "I am saying it is the best thing about you." She looked out the window. After a moment, she said, "The pharmaceutical sponsorship is going to come through. He just needs the right proposal structure. I can have something to Priya by Thursday." William said, "Of course you can." She said, "And the kitchen staff at these events should be paid better. They work harder than anyone in the room and nobody sees them." William said, "I will talk to the foundation about the next event." She said, "Good." She rested her head back against the seat and looked at the passing lights and thought about Amber at the sink beside her saying the people at these fancy parties had no idea how much work happened back here. And she thought that Amber was right, and that being right about something like that deserved more than just being right about it. She was going to do something about that. She usually did.